The night my husband's plane went down over the Gulf, I was in a hospital bed in Baton Rouge, screaming through the last hour of labor. They told me together. The nurse and the chaplain walked in at the same time, and I remember thinking that was strange. Why would a chaplain come to a delivery room? My daughter had just been born. She was wrapped in the yellow blanket and making that soft grunting sound that newborns make, like they're figuring out how air works. The nurse took her from my arms before I understood why. I don't remember the exact words. I remember the chaplain's hands. He kept pressing them together, like he was about to pray. I remember the word confirmed and the word wreckage. And then I remember the ceiling of that room, white and water-stained in one corner. And I stared at that stain for a long time while the sounds in the room became very far away. My husband was on flight 247 from Houston to New Orleans, a routine trip. He'd made it a dozen times for work. The plane experienced what they called a catastrophic engine failure 40 minutes after takeoff. 23 people on board. There were 6 survivors. My husband was not among them. His body was never recovered from the water. That was November 14th. My daughter came into the world at 11:52 that same night. I named her June I can't use that name. I named her Willa, after my grandmother, who was the toughest woman I ever knew, and I figured this baby would need to be tough too, because she had just lost her father before she ever had the chance to know what that word meant. For the first year, I existed more than I lived. My mother came to stay with me in our house in Metairie, a small brick house with a magnolia tree in the front yard that my husband had planted the spring before Willow was born. He'd said it would give her shade to play in when she got older. I used to stand at the kitchen window and look at that tree and feel something I couldn't name, not quite grief, not quite anger, something in between. His name was Conrad Aldrich. We met at LSU when I was 22 and he was 24, in a coffee shop on Highland Road during finals week. He spilled his entire Americano on my notes and spent the next 40 minutes helping me rewrite everything from memory, and I thought, this man is either the most considerate person I've ever met, or he's trying very hard to impress me. It turned out to be both. We married at 26. I was 7 months pregnant with Willa when he died. After the crash, the airline sent representatives. There were forms. So many forms. The NTSB investigation. A settlement that I won't name the amount of, because that feels wrong, but it kept the house paid. And it paid for Willa's childhood. There was also his life insurance policy, a $400,000 term policy we'd taken out together the year before because we'd read an article about young parents and financial planning and decided to be responsible adults about it. The insurance company investigated, as they always do with debts where a body isn't recovered, but the crash was documented. The wreckage was found. Other passengers confirmed the manifest. The payout came through 11 months after he died. I want to be very clear about that because it matters later. I went back to work when Willa was 10 months old. I was a paralegal at a firm downtown. My boss was a woman named Patricia who had raised 3 boys on her own after her first husband left, and she looked at me on my first day back with the kind of recognition that doesn't need words. She just said, "Take the office with the window," and that was that. Willa grew up in the way that children do when they are loved very hard by the people who remain. My mother, my sister, Patricia, who became something like a second mother to both of us over the years. Willa had a father-shaped space in her life, but she didn't know it as absence the way I did. She knew it as the photo on the bookshelf, Conrad in his green flannel shirt, laughing at something off camera, and as the stories I told her at bedtime when she was small, and as a particular kind of quietness that came over her face sometimes when other kids talked about their dads. She asked me once, when she was 7, if it hurt to talk about him. I said, a little, but the good memories don't. She nodded like she was filing that away. She was that kind of child, serious, observant, the kind who thinks before she speaks and means everything she says. She got his eyes in my stubbornness. By the time she was in high school, she was debating in the state championship and working part-time at a plant nursery. And she had more inner life than most adults I knew. I worried sometimes that the loss had made her grow up too fast, but I also saw the joy in her, real, uncomplicated joy, when she was with her friends, when she was in the garden, when she came home and told me about something funny that happened at school and laughed so hard she had to hold onto the counter. She was okay. We were okay. That was the story I told myself for 20 years. And it was true, mostly. It was just not the whole truth. She called me on a Thursday afternoon in October. She was 20 years old, home for fall break from Tulane, and she'd gone to spend the day with a college friend in Slidell. I was making dinner when my phone rang. Pasta? I think. Something ordinary. She said, Mom. Just that. One word. But I knew from the way she said it that something was wrong. I turned the burner off. What happened? Are you okay? She said she was okay. Then she said she needed to tell me something, and she needed me to listen to the whole thing before I said anything. I sat down at the kitchen table. She told me that she'd been at her friend's family barbecue, a neighborhood thing, casual, lots of people she didn't know. Her friend had introduced her around, and at some point she'd ended up talking to a man near the grill who seemed friendly, who asked where she went to school, who made a comment about Tulane's campus being beautiful. She said the man's name was listed in her friend's phone as Ray, Dad's work. She said he'd looked at her for a moment after she told him her name, and something had crossed his face. Just for a second. Then he'd looked away and made some excuse and moved on. She said his last name was Mercer, Raymond Mercer. She said she'd spent the rest of the afternoon staring at him from across the yard, trying to figure out why she felt like she recognized him from somewhere. She said she'd taken a photo on her phone, quietly from a distance. And when she got back to her friend's car and opened the photo and looked at it for a long time, she thought about the picture on our bookshelf. The green flannel shirt. The laugh. She said, Mom, I think that man might be Dad. I didn't say anything for a long time. She said my name. I said, Willa. That is not possible. She said, I know, but can I send you the photo? The photo came through. I sat at the kitchen table and I looked at it. A man, somewhere in his late 40s, standing near a grill with a paper plate in his hand. Heavier than I remembered. Hairline further back. Jaw, the same shape. That particular way of standing with his weight slightly forward that I used to tease Conrad about, used to say it made him look like he was always about to tell you something important. I told myself it was a coincidence. I told myself grief does strange things to the mind. 20 years was a long time. Memory warps. People resemble each other. The world is full of men with wide-set eyes and square jaws who stand a little forward on their feet. I told myself all of that, and then I sat in my kitchen until the pasta water went cold and I could not stop shaking. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the dark and had a conversation with myself that went in circles. Willa texted me around midnight. Are you okay? I wrote back, I'm fine. Get some sleep. Neither of those things was true. By morning, I had made a decision. Not about what I believed. I didn't know what I believed, but about what I was going to do. I was going to find out. I called in sick to work. I got in my car. Willa had given me the friend's last name, and from there I found the address. It was a residential neighborhood in Slidell, the kind with identical mailboxes and basketball hoops in the driveways. I didn't go to the house. I just sat in my car 2 blocks away and thought about what I was doing. I thought about Conrad. I thought about the way he'd cried when we found out I was pregnant. Not sad tears, but the other kind, the overwhelmed kind, standing in our bathroom holding the test and saying, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, over and over like a prayer. I thought about the Thursday morning he left for Houston, how he kissed me twice and put his hand on my stomach and said he'd be home Sunday. He was never home Sunday. I drove home without getting out of the car. I wasn't ready yet. But something had shifted. Some locked door inside me had been touched, not opened, just touched, and now I couldn't unfeel it. Over the next week, Willa and I talked every night. She'd done her own research. She was always thorough, that girl. And she'd found a Raymond Mercer living in Slidell, Louisiana, employed as a regional manager for a supply chain company. Married. 1 son. Middle school age. Married. I had to read that 3 times. Willa said she could keep digging if I wanted. I said no. I said let me think. But I hired someone instead. An investigator I found through Patricia, who knew everyone. A woman named Sandra with an office near the Superdome, who charged me $1,800 for 2 weeks of work and told me up front, sometimes the answer is nothing, and that's worth knowing too. 2 weeks later, Sandra sent me a folder. Raymond Mercer had moved to the Slidell area in 2008. Before that, records were sparse. The earliest documentation she could find was a Louisiana driver's license issued in November 2005, the same year as the crash. Before that, she said, it was like the man hadn't existed. She also sent, at the end of the folder, a side-by-side comparison, 2 photos. The photograph from our bookshelf, taken at a crawfish boil in 2004. The photo Willa had taken at the barbecue. I sat with that folder for a long time. Then I called Willa. I said, I believe you. I want to tell you what it is like to know something like this and not yet have done anything about it. It is like carrying a stone inside your chest, not heavy enough to stop you moving, but present. Every breath, every ordinary moment, every morning you make coffee and try to remember what normal feels like. I went to work. I cooked dinner. I called my mother on Sundays. I smiled at the right times. And underneath all of it, every day there was this: he is alive. He is 30 miles away in a house with a wife and a son and a job title and a driveway. And for 20 years, while I sat in a hospital room and held our newborn daughter alone and wrote his name on a memorial and buried an empty casket and rebuilt a life from nothing, he was alive. I don't have a word for what that feels like. Betrayal is too small. Grief is the wrong direction. It is something I had never felt before and hoped never to feel again. Willa asked me what I wanted to do. I said I wanted to look him in the eye. She offered to come with me. I said yes without hesitating, because I knew I couldn't do it alone, but also because I thought she deserved to be there. She had found him, and he had taken something from her too, something she'd never gotten to name, because she'd never known what it was supposed to look like. We planned it carefully. Willa's friend, who by now knew everything and was horrified, told us that Raymond, that Conrad, went to a diner near his office most Friday mornings, alone. 8 o'clock. We were there at 7:50. I tipped the booze by the window. Willa sat across from me. We ordered coffee, and neither of us touched it. He walked in at 8:04. I had thought a lot about what this moment would feel like. In my imagination it was loud, my heart pounding, my hands shaking, everything amplified. In reality I felt very still, almost calm. The way you feel in the seconds after a car accident, before the pain arrives. He ordered at the counter. He hadn't seen us yet. He was wearing a gray button-down. He looked tired in the way that middle-aged men look tired, like life has been pressing on them from above for a long time. He turned to find a seat. He saw Willa first, and I was watching his face so carefully. I watched him go still. Just for a moment. A flicker of something that could have been recognition, could have been fear. Then his eyes moved to me. The color left his face. He stood in the middle of that diner holding a coffee cup, and I looked at him and he looked at me, and 20 years collapsed into about 4 seconds of absolute silence. I said, "Sit down, Conrad." He sat down. I am not going to tell you everything he said, because some of it I am still not ready to repeat. But I will tell you the parts that matter. He admitted it immediately. He didn't try to deny it once I said his name. Our real name, the name I'd known him by, the name that was on our marriage certificate and Willa's birth certificate and the memorial stone in the cemetery off Veterans Boulevard. He just looked at the table and said, "Yes." He said he had been in a bad place. That's the phrase he used, a bad place. He said there had been debts he hadn't told me about, a business decision that had gone wrong before we met, money he'd borrowed from the wrong people, a situation that had been closing in on him for years. He said when the crash was announced and his name ended up on the manifest, he'd been bumped to a later flight, had given up his original seat to a standby passenger, had been in the airport bar watching the news come in. He said he saw an exit. He said it like that, an exit. Like our life was a building he needed to escape. I asked him about the insurance money. I needed to know. He said he hadn't known I would file the claim. I told him that was the most absurd thing I'd ever heard. He said he was sorry. He said he told himself the settlement from the airline would take care of us, me and the baby he knew was coming in weeks. He had convinced himself, he said, that we would be okay. Willa had not said a word. She was sitting very straight across from him, and she was watching him with an expression I recognized, the same one she'd had as a 7-year-old, filing things away. He turned to her at some point and said her name. She said, "You don't get to say my name." He stopped. He tried again, something about how he'd thought about her, how not a day had passed, the usual things people say when they want forgiveness they haven't earned. I watched Willa listen to all of it without changing her expression. When he finished, she said, "I want to ask you something." He said, "Okay." She said, "Did you know Mom was in labor when you made your decision?" He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he hadn't known exactly, that the baby wasn't due for another 3 weeks. She said, "But you knew she was alone." He didn't answer. She said, "You left her alone." She pushed her untouched coffee across the table, picked up her jacket, looked at me. "Are you ready?" I looked at Conrad one more time. The man I had loved, the man I had mourned, the man I had told stories about to a little girl at bedtime for 20 years. He was looking at the table again. He looked very small. I stood up. I said, "I'm going to have to talk to a lawyer about the insurance. You understand that?" He nodded. I said, "And Conrad, I need you to understand something. You didn't just leave me. You left her. And there's nothing you can say in this diner or anywhere else that changes what that cost her." He looked up then, and whatever he saw in my face must have been enough because he didn't say anything else. We walked out. The drive home took 45 minutes. Willa drove. I sat in the passenger seat and looked out the window at the flat Louisiana landscape, the cypress trees and the flat gray water and the long, low bridges, and I felt something I couldn't immediately name. It took me until we were almost home to recognize it. It was relief. Not happiness. Not resolution exactly. But something had been returned to me that I hadn't known I was still carrying. The question. The not knowing. The small, irrational part of me that had never fully believed, even after 20 years, even after the memorial and the settlement and the empty casket. Some part of me had always wanted a reason, had always felt that something didn't fit. And now I had the reason, and it was terrible, and it was also, somehow, solid, real. Something I could finally put down. I reached over and put my hand on Willa's arm. She said, without taking her eyes off the road, "Are you okay?" I said, "I will be." She nodded. Then she said, "Me too." We got home. I made tea. We sat at the kitchen table the same way we'd sat when she was small, and something hard happened at school. Me on one side, her on the other, mugs between us. The magnolia tree was visible through the kitchen window. It was tall now, spreading wide over the front yard like it owned the place. Conrad had planted it for her. I thought about telling her that and decided not to. Some things can just be a tree. She asked me what would happen next. I told her the truth. I didn't know exactly. I was going to call a lawyer on Monday. The insurance company would likely need to be notified. What he'd done, even passively, even without filing a false claim himself, had real legal consequences. Collecting on a life insurance policy for someone who was alive and had willingly disappeared. There were fraud statutes for that, even if the situation was complicated. I knew enough from 20 years of paralegal work to know it wasn't simple, but I also knew it wasn't nothing. She asked if I wanted her to be involved. I said, only if she wanted to be. She thought about it. She said, "I think I just want to not think about him for a while." I understood completely. She went back to Tulane 2 days later. She hugged me at the door for a long time, longer than usual. When she pulled back, her eyes were wet, which she would have hated me to mention, so I didn't. I stood on the porch and watched her car go down the street until I couldn't see it anymore. Then I went inside and I sat in the living room and I looked at the photograph on the bookshelf. The green flannel shirt. The laugh. The man I had built a whole interior life around mourning. I took the photograph down. I didn't throw it away. It was also the face of Willa's father, and that part wasn't mine alone to erase. I put it in a drawer. Not gone. Just not on the shelf anymore. I called my mother that night. I told her everything. She was silent for almost 30 seconds, which is a very long time on the phone. Then she said, "Well, he always did take the easy way out of everything." And I laughed. I actually laughed, the first real one in weeks, because my mother had known Conrad for 8 years and apparently had been keeping opinions about him in reserve, and apparently now was the time. "I'm okay," I told her. "We're okay." And this time I meant it differently than I had for 20 years. This time it wasn't something I was telling myself. It was something I actually knew. There's something I want to say to anyone who might be listening to this and carrying their own version of a question that was never answered. I know what it is to build a life on top of a loss that never fully made sense. I know what it is to grieve someone who is not quite real as a ghost, because the grief is real. The love was real. The empty space of the table is real. But underneath all of it, something never settled. I am not going to tell you that what I found was better than not knowing. In some ways it wasn't. In some ways the story I had before, the tragedy, the accident, the man who died before he got to be a father, was easier to live with than this one. But it was not true, and there is something in me after all of this that is finally exhaustingly done carrying something that was not mine to carry. He made a choice. I lived with the consequences of that choice for 20 years. My daughter grew up with the consequences of that choice. But she grew up. She grew up smart and strong and clear-eyed, the kind of person who sits across from a man who abandoned her before she was born and tells him, very quietly, "You don't get to say my name." She grew up into someone who knows the difference between what people owe you and what you're willing to take. I think she got that from the years, from watching a life get built from scratch, from knowing in some wordless way what it means to stay. I stayed. Every day for 20 years, I stayed. That magnolia tree in the front yard is 20 feet tall now. Willie used to climb it as a kid, used to sit up in the branches reading for hours while I pretended not to watch from the window. He planted it, but we watered it. I think that's enough. I've thought a lot about what kind of man makes the choice Conrad made. Not an impulsive one, that's what people assume, that something snapped. But it didn't snap. He stood in an airport bar, watched the news come in, and chose. That's not a moment of weakness. That's a character showing you exactly what it is. I used to wonder if I missed something, if there were signs I looked past because I was in love, or young, or both. Maybe there were. But I've stopped carrying that question like it belongs to me, because it doesn't. What he did came from something inside him that had nothing to do with how good a wife I was or wasn't. He took the exit because the exit was there. That's who he was. And here's what I know about how things work. After 50-something years of paying attention, the things we do in the dark don't stay there. Not forever. Conrad built a whole second life on a lie, and for 20 years it held. But Willow walked into a backyard barbecue on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, and something in her, that quiet, watchful intelligence she's carried since she was 7 years old, noticed. She couldn't even explain why at first. She just knew something was wrong. She trusted that instinct, followed it carefully, and brought the truth back into the light. That's not luck. That's what happens when you raise a child to think clearly and trust herself. I didn't do that on purpose, or not entirely. I was just trying to survive, most days. But Willa grew up watching me make hard decisions with what I had. She grew up understanding that honesty is not just a virtue, it's a foundation. When everything is built on it, it holds. When it isn't, eventually, something gives. What Conrad didn't account for, what people like him never account for, is that the people they leave behind don't just disappear. We keep living, we keep growing, and the daughter he walked away from the night she was born grew into someone with more integrity in one conversation than he'd had in 20 years. She sat across from him in that diner and told him the truth plainly, without cruelty, without theater. "You don't get to say my name." She didn't need to perform anger. She just needed to be clear. And she was. I think about what it took to get her there. Not just the years, but the daily decisions. To tell her the truth about her father in ways that were honest without being poisonous. To model what it looks like to keep going when keeping going is all you have. To let her see me fall apart sometimes and then get back up. None of that felt like teaching. It felt like surviving. But survival, done with enough intention, has a way of becoming something your children can use. She's going to be fine. She already is. She looked at the man who was supposed to be the first person in her life who loved her unconditionally, understood exactly what he was, and chose herself anyway. That kind of clarity, the kind that comes from good values, a sharp mind, and the toughness to act on both, that doesn't come from nowhere. It gets built, quietly, over years. I tipped the photo off the shelf. I put it in a drawer. The magnolia tree is still there. We watered it.